This man claims he died in a devastating car crash after a failed suicide attempt, and what he experienced in those moments between life and death would forever change not only his life but the lives of countless others. Michael Anderson was a broken soul abandoned as a baby, raised in religious abuse and pushed to the brink of despair. But his journey through the valley of death would reveal shocking truths about his past, his family, and the very nature of divine love itself. From a dramatic encounter with Jesus to uncovering a decades-old deception that tore his family apart, Michael's story challenges everything we think we know about faith, forgiveness, and the power of unconditional love. Now, in his own words, he shares the remarkable tale of how his near-death experience led to a mother's miracle, an aunt's confession, and a revelation that would shake an entire community to its core. This is his story. The windshield wipers fought desperately against the pounding rain as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white with tension. My friend Sarah's voice echoed in the passenger seat, begging me to slow down, but her words were just distant noise in my head. The speedometer crept past 90 on the winding mountain road. Then I saw a deer frozen in my headlights. Everything slowed down. I jerked the wheel hard to the right, and the world began to spin. Metal screamed against guardrail. The sensation of weightlessness. Sarah's scream piercing the night. In that moment, I remembered my mother's rosary, still sitting in the glove box after all these years. The car rolled once, twice, 3 times down the steep embankment. Glass shattered, metal twisted, and then silence. I found myself floating, watching from above as emergency vehicles arrived, their red and blue lights painting the rain-soaked scene in surreal colors. Below, I could see my body crumpled in the driver's seat. Sarah was being pulled from the wreckage, alive but hysterical. That's when I felt it a pull, gentle at first, then overwhelming. Not the peaceful light people talk about, but a violent vortex of energy and emotion. As I was drawn upward, memories flashed before me, my mother's face I'd never known, Aunt Sarah's cruel discipline. In the name of God, years of loneliness and pain. But this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of a journey that would reveal truths I never could have imagined and change not only my life but the lives of everyone I loved. I was born in Los Angeles on a stormy December night in 1998, though I wouldn't learn the details until much later. My first memory isn't of a mother's loving embrace or a father's proud smile. It's of cold rain and the harsh glare of streetlights through a dumpster lid. I was 6 months old when my mother, Amanda Anderson, made the decision that would shape my entire existence. They told me she was a promising model, her face gracing local magazine covers and her future bright with possibility. Then I came along, an unplanned interruption to her rising career. The story goes that on that rainy night she walked to St. Michael's Church, her designer heels clicking against wet pavement. She placed me in a cardboard box near the dumpster, tucked her rosary beads beside me, and whispered something I'll never know. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps an apology. Tom Miller, the church custodian, found me that night. He always said it was divine intervention that made him take out the trash earlier than usual. The sound of my crying, barely audible over the storm, led him to my makeshift cradle. The rosary beads, silver and pearl, with a crucifix that bore the inscription "With eternal love," Mom became my only connection to a mother I didn't know. Child Services placed me with my Aunt Sarah, my mother's older sister, and a woman whose devotion to God was matched only by her capacity for cruelty. Her Victorian house in Pasadena became my prison, its walls adorned with crosses and biblical quotes that seemed to watch my every move. Spare the rod and spoil the child, Proverbs 13:24, became her favorite justification for what she called godly discipline. The basement became my frequent punishment chamber, where I would kneel for hours on hard concrete, reciting verses until my voice gave out. Aunt Sarah believed she was saving my soul, cleansing me of my mother's sin of abandonment. "Your mother chose vanity over God's gift," she would say, her voice sharp as broken glass. "But we'll make sure you choose right, Michael." I learned early to hide my bruises at school, to smile and say I'm fine when teachers asked concerned questions. Every Sunday we'd sit in the front pew at church, Aunt Sarah's hand gripping my shoulder like a vice while Pastor Johnson preached about God's love. The irony wasn't lost on me, even as a child. My only solace came from my cousin Emily, Aunt Sarah's daughter, who would secretly bring me food when I was locked in the basement, and tend to my wounds after particularly harsh lessons. She was 3 years older than me and became the closest thing to a loving family I had. But even she couldn't protect me from the darkness that grew inside me with each passing year. I kept my mother's rosary hidden beneath a loose floorboard in my room, taking it out late at night when the house was quiet. I would run my fingers over the beads, trying to imagine the woman who had left them with me. Did she ever think about me? Did she regret her choice? These questions haunted me, shaping my understanding of love, God, and family into something twisted and confused. By the time I turned 18, the emotional scars ran deeper than any physical marks Aunt Sarah had left. I graduated high school with decent grades but a broken spirit, carrying within me a conflicted relationship with faith that would eventually drive me to that rainy night on the mountain road. But before that final drive, before the crash that would change everything, I spent years searching for something, anything to fill the void my mother's abandonment had left. I didn't know then that my journey through death would lead me not just to answers, but to a truth more profound than I could have imagined. The years after high school became a blur of dead-end jobs and growing isolation. While my peers went off to college or started careers, I drifted between minimum wage positions: grocery store clerk, warehouse worker, night security guard. Each paycheck barely covered rent for my tiny studio apartment in the rougher part of town, but it was still better than living under Aunt Sarah's roof. Emily tried to stay in touch, but Aunt Sarah's influence ran deep. "You're choosing the path of sin," she would tell her daughter whenever Emily mentioned my name. Eventually, the calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether. I learned later that Aunt Sarah had threatened to cut Emily off financially if she continued contact with me. The church remained a complicated presence in my life. Some Sundays I'd find myself sitting in the back pew of random churches, not for the sermons but for the feeling of belonging they provided, however temporary. Yet each time a pastor spoke of God's love, I couldn't help but think of the welts Aunt Sarah's godly discipline had left on my back. Depression crept in slowly, then all at once. I started drinking, not heavily at first, just enough to numb the constant ache of loneliness. The rosary beads came out more frequently now, no longer bringing comfort but serving as a bitter reminder of abandonment. I would trace the inscription with "Eternal Love, Mom," until the words lost all meaning. Work became increasingly difficult to maintain. I was fired from the warehouse for missing too many shifts, lost the security job for showing up hungover. Each failure seemed to confirm what Aunt Sarah had drilled into me, that I was worthless, a burden, unwanted even by my own mother. The breaking point came during a particularly dark winter night. I was down to my last few dollars, facing eviction, when I decided to search for my mother online. It wasn't the first time I'd tried, but something felt different that night. Maybe it was desperation, maybe divine intervention. I found an old modeling agency website with her photo, Amanda Anderson, still beautiful, now running her own agency in Seattle. With trembling hands, I called my grandmother, the only other family member who occasionally sent Christmas cards. She was surprised to hear from me, but confirmed she had my mother's number. "She's different now," my grandmother said softly. "Maybe it's time." That call to my mother would become the catalyst for everything that followed. Her voice, when she answered, was cold and professional. When I said who I was, there was a long pause. Then came the words that would drive me to that mountain road: "I don't want you. You're not my son. Don't ever call this number again." The phone shattered against my apartment wall before her last words had finished echoing in my ears. In that moment, something inside me broke completely. The last thread of hope I'd been clinging to snapped. I spent the next 3 days in a daze, barely eating, barely sleeping, just staring at those rosary beads and wondering how anyone could inscribe eternal love on something they'd abandoned in a storm. That's when the train schedule started to look inviting. I memorized the times, planned it all out carefully, but fate, or God, or whatever you want to call it, had other plans. The night I chose to end it all would become the beginning of something I never could have imagined. The day I decided to die started like any other. I woke up on my threadbare couch, empty bottles littering the floor, the eviction notice still taped to my door. Sarah, my only real friend and coincidentally named the same as my aunt, had been texting me constantly, worried about my state of mind after my mother's rejection. I ignored them all. That morning I went to the local diner where I'd been washing dishes for the past 3 months. My manager, Dave, took one look at me and shook his head. "You look like hell," Mikey said, not unkindly. Maybe you should take the day off, but I knew what taking the day off meant: another missed paycheck, another step closer to homelessness. I made it through 4 hours before I cut myself badly on a broken plate. As I watched the blood mix with the dishwater, something in me just snapped. I walked out without a word, leaving Dave calling after me. Another job lost, another failure to add to my growing collection. On my way home, I passed St. Michael's Church, the same one where I'd been found as a baby. The irony wasn't lost on me. Through the stained glass windows, I could see people gathering for afternoon prayer. They looked so peaceful, so certain of their place in the world. I hadn't felt that kind of certainty since, well, ever. Back in my apartment, I found an unexpected package. Inside was a photo album I'd requested from my grandmother weeks ago before everything fell apart. The images told a story I wasn't prepared for: my mother at various modeling shoots, her smile radiant, her future bright. And there, in the last few photos, was her pregnant belly, her hand resting protectively over it. The date stamp showed it was just weeks before she abandoned me. Something about seeing those photos, seeing her looking so happy while carrying the child she would later throw away like trash, broke something fundamental inside me. I took out the rosary beads and hurled them across the room. They hit the wall with a satisfying crack, beads scattering across the floor like tears. Sarah chose that moment to show up at my door. She had a key for emergencies, she'd said, and found me sitting among the scattered beads, the photo album open beside me. "Mike," she said softly, "talk to me." But I was beyond talking. The words that came out were bitter, twisted things. I told her about my mother's rejection, about losing another job, about the years of abuse at Aunt Sarah's hands. And then I told her about the train schedule I'd memorized, about the perfect spot I'd found where the tracks curved through a wooded area. Her face went pale. "You need help, Mike. Professional help. Let me take you to the hospital." "I'm beyond help," I replied, my voice eerily calm. "I've been beyond help since the day my mother left me in that dumpster." She tried to reason with me, tried to grab my arm, but I pushed past her. The last thing I heard as I ran down the stairs was her desperate voice calling my name. I didn't know then that she was already calling someone else, already putting a plan in motion to save my life, a plan that would ultimately lead to that fateful crash. I walked for hours through the city streets, past the church where my story began, past the park where Aunt Sarah used to make me kneel on gravel while reciting Bible verses, past all the landmarks of my broken life. The train tracks were my destination. I'd spent weeks watching the schedule, knowing exactly when the 9:45 freight train would come thundering through. My phone kept buzzing, Sarah probably trying to talk me down. I turned it off. The sun was setting when I reached the tracks, casting long shadows across the rusted rails. The spot I'd chosen was perfect, a curve where the train wouldn't be able to stop in time, even if the conductor saw me. I sat on a nearby rock, watching the sky turn from orange to purple to deep blue. Then I heard it, not the train, but a car engine, tires crunching on gravel. Sarah's blue Honda pulled up, her headlights cutting through the gathering darkness. "Mike," she called out, panic in her voice. "Please don't do this." I was about 10 feet from the tracks when I heard the train's horn in the distance. Perfect timing, I thought. But Sarah was running toward me now, and something in her desperation made me hesitate. That's when my phone, which I'd turned back on without thinking, started ringing. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer. "Hello," I said, and heard my mother's voice for the second time in my life. "Your grandmother said you were looking for me," she said, her tone cold and professional. "I'm calling to tell you again I don't want you. You're not my son. Never were, never will be." The world seemed to stop. I looked at Sarah, tears streaming down her face, then at the approaching train lights. With a calm I didn't know I possessed, I walked to her car. She thought I was giving up, choosing life. She was wrong. We drove in silence for a few minutes, Sarah probably thinking she'd saved me. The mountain road stretched before us, dark and winding. I waited until we hit the steepest part, where the guardrail was the only thing between the road and a 100-foot drop. "I'm sorry," I whispered, and I meant it. Then I jerked the wheel hard to the right. Sarah's scream pierced the night as the car smashed through the guardrail. Time seemed to slow down as we began to roll. I could see everything with perfect clarity, the terror on Sarah's face, the trees spinning outside the windows, the rosary beads I'd retrieved flying from the glove box. The first impact was the hardest. Metal screamed against rock as we rolled down the embankment. Glass shattered around us like deadly rain. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end, almost welcoming it. The last thing I heard was Sarah calling my name, not in anger but in love, and for a moment I felt a stab of regret. Then everything went black. When I opened my eyes again, I was floating above the scene. Emergency vehicles were arriving, their lights painting everything in surreal colors. I could see my body being cut from the wreckage, Sarah being loaded into an ambulance, alive but hysterical. I felt no pain, no fear, just a strange sense of detachment. That's when I felt the pull not upward toward a peaceful light, but sideways into what looked like a swirling vortex of energy. As I was drawn in, I heard a voice, not my mother's, not Aunt Sarah's, but something both ancient and new. Michael Anderson, your time is not yet done. The vortex pulled me into what I can only describe as absolute nothingness. There was no up or down, no light or dark, just existence in its purest form. Then suddenly I was somewhere else entirely. A place that defied physical description, yet felt more real than anything I'd ever experienced. That's when I saw him. Not the vengeful God of Aunt Sarah's teachings, not the distant deity I'd grown to resent, but someone entirely different. He appeared not in blinding light or heavenly grandeur, but as a presence of such pure love that it brought me to my knees. His face held both infinite wisdom and boundless compassion, and when he spoke, his voice resonated through every fiber of my being. Michael, he said, and in that single word I felt every moment of pain, every tear I'd ever shed, every cry for help I thought had gone unanswered. My child, why have you lost faith in love? I wanted to be angry, to scream about abandonment and abuse and years of suffering, but in his presence my defenses crumbled. Instead, I wept. Where were you, I asked. When my mother left me, when Aunt Sarah hurt me, when everything fell apart, where were you? Then something extraordinary happened. Like a cosmic projector, scenes from my life began playing around us. But I wasn't just watching them, I was feeling every moment from multiple perspectives. I felt my mother's anguish as she left me at the church, her heart shattering with each step away. I felt Tom Miller's divine nudge to check the dumpster early that night. I even felt Aunt Sarah's twisted conviction that her abuse was saving my soul. Watch, he said gently, and I saw moments I'd forgotten or never noticed. The school nurse who always kept extra food in her office for me. Emily's silent prayers as she tended my wounds. Sarah's unwavering friendship despite my attempts to push her away. Each moment a tiny light in what I'd seen as unrelenting darkness. But the pain I protested, the loneliness, the rejection. Pain shapes us, he replied, but it need not define us with a gesture. He showed me something else, the ripples of my existence touching others' lives. Children I'd helped at various jobs, small kindnesses I'd forgotten, moments where my presence had made a difference I never knew about. Then came the most difficult part. He showed me my suicide attempt, but from Sarah's perspective. I felt her desperate love, her terror, her determination to save me. The agony in her heart as our car went over the edge. The guilt crushed me more thoroughly than the crash had. Your life, he said, is not yours alone to end. It is a gift intertwined with countless others. Your mother's choice was born of love, a desperate, flawed love, but love nonetheless. Even Aunt Sarah, in her brokenness, loved you in the only way she knew how. I saw then what he meant. Every life I touched, every future interaction I could have, every possibility for healing and growth, all of it interconnected in a vast web of divine purpose. The revelation brought me to my knees. But what am I supposed to do, I asked, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. How can I go back after everything that's happened? His smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Love, Michael. Not the conditional love you've known, but the kind that transforms, that heals, that redeems. Your story isn't finished, it's barely begun. Then he showed me one final vision, a future I could hardly comprehend. I saw myself working with troubled youth, sharing my story, breaking cycles of abuse. I saw reconciliation with my mother, understanding with Aunt Sarah, deeper bonds with Sarah and Emily. I saw healing, not just for myself, but spreading outward like ripples in a pond. The choice is yours, he said, as it has always been. But know this, you have never been alone, and you never will be. In that moment, I understood what real love was: not the fearful, controlling thing I'd been taught, but something vast and unconditional, something that could heal every broken piece of me. And for the first time in my life, I felt truly, completely whole. I woke to the rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors and the sterile smell of antiseptic. Opening my eyes felt like lifting weights, but when I finally managed it, I saw Sarah sitting beside my bed, her arm in a cast, her face bruised but alive. The guilt hit me like a physical blow. "You've been out for 3 days," she said softly, noticing I was awake. "The doctors. They said it was a miracle. You shouldn't have survived that crash, Mike. Your heart stopped twice on the operating table." I tried to speak, but my throat was too dry. Sarah helped me sip some water through a straw. The simple kindness of that gesture, after what I'd done to her, made my eyes well up with tears. "I'm so sorry," I managed to whisper. "Sarah, I'm so sorry." She took my hand, careful of the IV lines. "I know, but you're here now. That's what matters." The next few days were a blur of doctors, nurses, and physical therapy. My body had been broken in ways that should have been fatal: multiple fractures, internal bleeding, severe head trauma. Yet somehow I was healing at a rate that baffled the medical staff. "I've never seen anything like it," my primary doctor admitted during rounds. But the physical recovery was only part of the story. The experience with Jesus, though it felt inadequate to call it just an experience, had fundamentally changed something inside me. Colors seemed brighter, sounds clearer. Every interaction, even with the grumpiest nurse, felt like an opportunity for connection and healing. Sarah visited every day despite her own injuries. She never mentioned the crash or my suicide attempt, but I could see the questions in her eyes. Finally, one quiet afternoon, I told her everything about the vision, about Jesus, about the web of interconnected lives he'd shown me. I expected skepticism or concern about head trauma, but she just listened, tears streaming down her face. "I believe you," she said when I finished. "I've been praying for a miracle since the day I met you, Mike. Not just for you to survive, but for you to find peace." The hospital psychiatrist, Dr. Thompson, became another unexpected ally. Unlike the cold professionals I'd encountered before, she approached my experience with genuine openness. "Near-death experiences often provide profound insights," she said. "The question is, how will you use those insights moving forward?" And that question became my focal point during recovery. Each painful step in physical therapy, each moment of discomfort became an opportunity to remember his words: "Pain shapes us, but it need not define us." A week into my recovery, Emily somehow found out I was there. She showed up one afternoon looking exactly like the caring cousin I remembered, despite the years of separation. "Aunt Sarah doesn't know I'm here," she whispered, hugging me carefully. "But I had to come. I've missed you so much, Mike." The most surprising visitor came 2 weeks after the crash. I was doing my daily walk around the ward when I saw her, my grandmother, whom I'd only known through occasional Christmas cards. She stood in the doorway of my room, clutching her purse, looking uncertain. "Michael," she said, her voice trembling, "I should have done more. All these years I should have fought harder for you." That night, after she left, I found something she'd slipped under my pillow: a stack of letters, all addressed to me, all returned unopened. They were from my mother, written over years, never reaching their destination. On each envelope, in Aunt Sarah's unmistakable handwriting, was written "Return to sender." The discovery should have angered me, but instead I felt a profound sense of peace. Everything, the pain, the confusion, the years of feeling unwanted, was part of a larger picture I was only beginning to understand. As my discharge date approached, the questions about what next became more pressing. My apartment was long gone, my job too. But for the first time in my life, uncertainty didn't feel like an enemy. Each challenge seemed like an opportunity, each setback a chance for growth. The day before I was released, Dr. Thompson brought me news that would set the course for everything that followed. "There's a position," she said, "at a youth rehabilitation center. They need someone who understands trauma, who's been through darkness and found their way back. Someone like you, Michael." The Youth Rehabilitation Center, Hope Haven, was housed in a renovated Victorian mansion not unlike Aunt Sarah's, but the similarities ended there. Where her house had been a prison of fear and punishment, this place radiated warmth and acceptance. Sarah had offered to let me stay with her during my recovery, but something about this opportunity felt right, like the next step on the path I'd been shown. My first day was overwhelming in its intensity. 20 teenagers, all carrying their own wounds, their own stories of abandonment and abuse. I recognized the look in their eyes, the same one I'd seen in my own reflection for so many years. The staff introduced me as a peer counselor, but the kids immediately sensed something different about me. "You're like us, aren't you?" a girl named Jessica asked during my first group session. She had scars on her wrists that she didn't bother to hide. "You've been through it too." I nodded, and for the first time in my life shared my story publicly, all of it. The abandonment, the abuse, the suicide attempt, and yes, the divine intervention. Some kids shifted uncomfortably at the religious elements, but they all understood the core message: pain doesn't have to be the end of your story. As weeks turned into months, I found myself healing alongside these kids. Each time I helped one of them process their trauma, I understood my own better. When I talked about forgiveness, I wasn't just speaking to them, I was learning to forgive my mother, Aunt Sarah, and most importantly, myself. The work was challenging but deeply fulfilling. I started developing programs that combined traditional therapy with spiritual elements, not pushing religion but offering space for kids to explore their own beliefs about meaning and purpose. Dr. Thompson, who consulted for the center, helped me refine these approaches. One particular breakthrough came with a boy named Marcus who'd been in and out of foster homes since age 5. He was angry, violent, convinced that God had abandoned him. His story hit so close to home that I almost asked to be taken off his case. But during one session, as he raged about his mother's betrayal, I saw myself in him so clearly that I knew exactly what he needed to hear. "Your pain is real," I told him, "and it's not fair. But it's not the end of your story unless you let it be." I shared with him what Jesus had shown me about the interconnected web of lives, about how our struggles could become stepping stones for others. Something in Marcus shifted that day. Within weeks, he was helping newer residents adjust, showing them that change was possible. The transformation wasn't just professional. Sarah and I grew closer, our friendship deepening into something neither of us had expected. She visited the center often, sharing her side of our story with the kids, showing them what true friendship looked like. Emily started volunteering on weekends, bridging the gap that years of separation had created. I even started attending church again, not the rigid, punishing institution of my childhood, but a small community congregation that emphasized love and acceptance. The pastor, David Williams, became both a mentor and friend, helping me reconcile my supernatural experience with everyday faith. One Sunday after service, Pastor David pulled me aside. "The kids at the center," he said, "they're not the only ones who've changed. You're not the same person who woke up in that hospital bed." He was right. The angry, broken man who had driven off that cliff was gone. In his place was someone who understood that pain could be transformed into purpose, that the darkest moments could lead to the greatest light. Then came the letter that would test everything I'd learned about forgiveness and healing. It arrived at the center on a rainy Tuesday, the handwriting on the envelope hauntingly familiar from those returned letters my grandmother had shown me. My mother had found me. The letter sat unopened on my desk for 3 days. Sarah offered to read it first, to shield me from any potential pain, but I knew this was something I had to face myself. When I finally opened it, my hands trembling slightly, I found 10 pages of tear-stained confessions. My mother, Amanda, wrote about the night she left me not at a dumpster as I'd been told, but on the church steps with a letter explaining everything. She'd been young, terrified, and trapped in an abusive relationship with my father. He'd threatened to kill both of us if she kept me. The choice to leave me at the church had been born of desperate love, hoping I'd find safety in a better life. But the story didn't end there. She'd returned the next morning, only to find me gone. Aunt Sarah had found me first, taken me to her house, and begun orchestrating a narrative of abandonment that would shape the next 25 years. All those returned letters, all the cruel words, had been part of her systematic effort to keep us apart. The final pages contained something that stopped my heart medical records. My mother had stage 4 cancer. "I don't tell you this to gain your sympathy," she wrote. "I tell you because if there's any chance for reconciliation, it has to be now. I understand if you want nothing to do with me. But if you're willing, I'm staying at the Riverside Hotel, room 412. I sat in my office until dawn, reading and rereading the letter. The kids noticed my distraction the next day, especially Marcus. "Something's wrong," he said during our session. "You've got that same look I had when my mom tried to contact me." His insight struck me. Here I was, counseling others about forgiveness and healing, facing my own ultimate test. I called Sarah and Emily, sharing the contents of the letter. Their reactions couldn't have been more different. Sarah was cautiously supportive, while Emily was furious at her mother's decades of deception. "You don't owe her anything," Emily insisted, "after everything you've been through." But as I held my mother's rosary, the one I'd kept all these years, I knew what I had to do. Jesus had shown me the interconnected nature of all our lives, the way pain and love weave together in patterns we can't always understand. This was my chance to break the cycle. I went to the hotel that evening. Room 412 felt like both an ending and a beginning. When she opened the door, I wasn't prepared for what I saw. The beautiful model from those old photos was gone, replaced by a frail woman with hollow cheeks and tired eyes. But when she smiled, I saw myself in her face for the first time. "Michael," she whispered, and collapsed into my arms, sobbing. We spent hours talking, filling in the gaps of 25 years. She showed me more letters, photographs, birthday cards, all intercepted by Aunt Sarah. She'd tried to find me countless times, even hired private investigators, but Aunt Sarah's influence in the community had blocked every attempt. The hardest part was hearing about my father, how he'd threatened her, how she'd finally escaped him, how she'd lived in fear that he'd find me if she stayed in contact. He'd died years ago in a prison fight, but his shadow still haunted her. "I thought I was protecting you," she said, her voice breaking. "But I just ended up hurting you in a different way. Can you ever forgive me?" Looking at her, I saw what Jesus had shown me in that divine encounter: the complexity of love, the weight of impossible choices, the potential for healing even in our deepest wounds. I took her hand and placed the rosary in it. "I already have," I said. The confrontation with Aunt Sarah wasn't something I planned, but fate had other ideas. It happened after church one Sunday, just 2 weeks after reuniting with my mother. I'd been attending services regularly at Pastor David's congregation, finding healing in a faith no longer twisted by fear. That morning, Aunt Sarah was there, sitting in her usual front row seat at her own church across town when I walked in with my mother. The congregation fell silent. Aunt Sarah turned slowly, her face draining of color as she saw us standing together. 25 years of deception crumbled in that single moment. She rose from her pew, Bible clutched to her chest like a shield, and pointed a trembling finger at my mother. "You abandoned him," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "You threw him away like garbage. You have no right to be here." But my mother stood firm, drawing strength I didn't know she had. "Tell them the truth, Sarah," she said quietly. "Tell them about the letters. Tell them about the church steps, not the dumpster. Tell them everything." I watched as Aunt Sarah's carefully constructed world began to unravel. Church members who had witnessed her godly discipline over the years started murmuring. Emily, who had chosen to stand with us, stepped forward with a box, every intercepted letter, every returned card, every piece of evidence of her mother's decades-long deception. "You had no right," Aunt Sarah screamed, her composure shattering completely. She was unfit. A Jezebel. I saved him from her sinful life. Pastor Johnson, who had presided over my childhood torment, looked uncomfortable. "Sister Sarah," he began, "perhaps we should discuss this in private." "No," I said, finding my voice at last. "This needs to be heard. Every bruise, every scar, every moment of abuse justified in God's name. It all started with a lie. You didn't save me, Aunt Sarah. You stole me." The truth poured out there in the sanctuary, how she'd found me on the church steps that night, read my mother's letter explaining everything, and deliberately created a different narrative. How she'd intercepted every attempt at contact, convinced the community that my mother was a monster, and used religion to justify her cruelty. "I did it for your soul," she insisted, tears streaming down her face. "Your mother was living in sin, modeling, dating ungodly men. I had to save you." "By beating me?" I asked quietly. "By locking me in the basement? By teaching me that God was as cruel and unforgiving as you?" The congregation was stunned. Many had suspected something wasn't right over the years, but no one had dared question Aunt Sarah's authority. Now, watching her facade crumble, they saw the truth they'd ignored for so long. Emily stepped forward, placing the box of letters on the altar. "I found these in Mom's attic last week," she said, her voice shaking. "Every letter Aunt Amanda wrote, every birthday card, every attempt to reach Michael, all hidden away while Mom preached about honesty and godliness." Aunt Sarah lunged for the box, but Pastor Johnson intercepted her. As he began reading one of the letters aloud, my mother's desperate plea to know if her baby was safe, Aunt Sarah collapsed in the aisle, wailing about salvation and sin and the corruption of the world. I felt no satisfaction in her breakdown, only a profound sadness. Looking at her there, I saw what Jesus had shown me, a broken woman so convinced of her own righteousness that she'd twisted love into something unrecognizable. My mother touched my arm gently. "We should go," she whispered. But before we left, I knelt beside Aunt Sarah. "I forgive you," I said softly. "Not because you deserve it, but because holding on to hate will only destroy me. And I won't let you have that power anymore." The weeks following the church confrontation were a blur of hospital visits and chemotherapy sessions. My mother's cancer was aggressive, spreading faster than the doctors had anticipated. I took leave from Hope Haven to spend every possible moment with her, making up for lost decades in whatever time we had left. Between treatments, she shared stories of my early months, how she'd sing to me, how I'd grip her finger while nursing, how she'd dreamed of the life we might have had together. Each memory was a gift, but also a reminder of what Aunt Sarah had stolen from us. The hardest moments were when the pain medication wore off and she'd cry out, asking God why we had to find each other only to be separated again. "I'm not ready," she confessed one particularly difficult night, her body racked with pain. "There's so much I still need to tell you, so much time to make up for. I can't leave you again, Michael, I can't." Sarah and Emily took turns helping me care for her, creating a rotating schedule so someone was always there. Even some of the kids from Hope Haven visited, especially Marcus, who seemed to understand exactly what I was going through. They brought drawings, cards, and most importantly, their stories of how I'd helped them find hope in their darkest moments. Then came the night that changed everything. I was dozing in the hospital chair when the monitors started screaming. My mother's heart had stopped. The room filled with medical staff, someone pulled me away, and time seemed to stretch like taffy. I found myself praying like I never had before. Not the fearful prayers of my childhood, but a desperate plea to the God of love I'd met during my own near-death experience. "Please," I begged, "not now. Not when we've just found each other." The doctors worked for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Finally, they stepped back, their faces grim. "I'm sorry," the lead physician began, but before he could finish, something extraordinary happened. My mother's eyes flew open, and she sat up with a strength she hadn't shown in weeks. "Michael." She gasped. I saw him. "The same presence you described, all love, all light. He showed me everything, all the years we lost, but also all the beauty that came from our pain. The lives you've touched, the healing you've brought to others." The medical staff was stunned. Her vital signs had stabilized and color was returning to her cheeks. The doctor called it a spontaneous remission, but we knew better. This was the same divine intervention that had saved me on that mountain road. Over the next few days, her recovery defied all medical explanation. The cancer markers in her blood began dropping dramatically. Tumors visible on scans started shrinking. The doctors used words like unprecedented and miraculous, but couldn't explain what was happening. "He told me my work wasn't finished," my mother explained, "that our story of healing could help others find their way back to love. He showed me how all the broken pieces of our lives were being woven into something beautiful." As her strength returned, we began making plans. She wanted to sell her modeling agency and use the money to establish a foundation helping mothers and children in crisis. The idea resonated deeply with my work at Hope Haven, creating safe spaces for healing and reconciliation. But our newfound peace was about to be tested. Aunt Sarah, who had been suspiciously quiet since the church confrontation, suddenly reappeared with a vengeance. She'd filed a formal complaint with the youth center's board, claiming I was mentally unstable and promoting dangerous religious delusions to vulnerable children. My mother, still weak but determined, insisted on facing her sister one final time. "She's still my sister," she said, "and somewhere beneath all that fear and control is the little girl who used to protect me from our father's rage. We have to try to reach her, not just for us, but for Emily too." The board meeting at Hope Haven felt like a trial. I sat at one end of the long mahogany table, my mother beside me, while Aunt Sarah occupied the other end, surrounded by stacks of documents and a lawyer who looked as cold as she did. The room was packed with board members, staff, and even some of the older residents who had insisted on being present. Aunt Sarah's attack was methodical and cruel. She presented my suicide attempt as evidence of mental instability, my near-death experience as a psychotic break, and my spiritual transformation as dangerous religious manipulation. Her lawyer displayed photos of my childhood injuries, now twisted into evidence of my own violent tendencies rather than her abuse. This man, she declared, pointing at me with a trembling finger, is dangerous. He's feeding these vulnerable children the same delusions that led him to drive off a cliff. How long before one of them follows his example? Marcus, who had refused to leave despite staff objections, stood up suddenly. "You're wrong," he said, his voice shaking but strong. "Mr. Anderson saved my life. I was where he was ready to end it all. He showed me there was another way." Other kids joined in, sharing their stories of how I'd helped them find hope and healing. But Aunt Sarah wasn't finished. She pulled out her final weapon, a psychiatric evaluation she'd somehow obtained from my hospital stay after the crash. Delusional disorder, she read aloud. Religious preoccupation. Suicidal ideation. Is this who you want influencing troubled youth? My mother, still pale from her treatments but radiating inner strength, slowly rose to her feet. "Sarah," she said softly enough, "you've spent 25 years trying to control and destroy what you couldn't understand. Look at these children. Look at their faces. This is what real healing looks like." But Aunt Sarah's next words froze the blood in my veins. "Your cancer returning is God's judgment," she spat at my mother. "He's punishing you for abandoning your child, for your sinful life, for turning my own daughter against me." The room fell silent. My mother swayed slightly, and I caught her just as her knees buckled. Her skin was burning with fever, the same fever that had preceded her previous crisis. The meeting dissolved into chaos as someone called for an ambulance. As paramedics rushed my mother to the hospital, I heard Aunt Sarah's voice behind me. "You see, God's will cannot be denied." The next 3 days were a nightmare of hospital corridors and beeping machines. The cancer had indeed returned, more aggressive than before. The doctors spoke in hushed tones about how unprecedented this was, how the previous remission had given them hope. Emily stayed with me in the hospital, her presence a silent rebellion against her mother. Sarah brought food I couldn't eat and coffee I drank without tasting. The kids from Hope Haven kept vigil in the waiting room, their prayers and support a lifeline in the darkness. But the worst part wasn't the medical crisis, it was the seed of doubt Aunt Sarah had planted. Had I been fooling myself? Were my experiences just delusions? The faith that had seemed so solid began to crack under the weight of fear and uncertainty. Late one night, alone in the hospital chapel, I found myself crying out like Jesus on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The silence that answered seemed to confirm my deepest fears. That night in the chapel stretched into what felt like an eternity. The same thoughts kept circling in my mind. Maybe Aunt Sarah was right. Maybe everything I'd experienced, the divine encounter, the healing, the sense of purpose, was just my broken mind creating comfort in chaos. The old darkness began creeping back, familiar and almost welcome in its certainty. I found myself walking the hospital corridors, eventually ending up on the roof. The same pull I'd felt on that mountain road returned, the seductive whisper that ending it all would be easier than facing what was coming. The city lights spread out below, distant and cold, just like they had been the night I'd tried to jump in front of the train. "You can't save her," a voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like Aunt Sarah whispered. "You can't save those kids. You can't even save yourself." I took a step closer to the edge, then another. The wind tugged at my clothes, and for a moment I felt that same weightless sensation I'd experienced during the crash. It would be so easy. "Mr. Anderson." Marcus's voice cut through the darkness. He stood by the roof access door, looking smaller and younger than his 16 years. "We've been looking for you. Your mom. She's asking for you." The simple reality of those words pulled me back from the edge, both literally and figuratively. What was I doing? How could I even think about giving up when my mother needed me? When kids like Marcus needed me? Racing back to her room, I found her awake and alert, though clearly exhausted. I saw him again, she whispered as I took her hand. He showed me something important, Michael. Something you need to see. She described a vision of Aunt Sarah as a young girl hiding in a closet while their father raged through the house. How she'd prayed for protection, making a bargain with God that if he saved them, she'd dedicate her life to saving others from evil. How that pure intention had twisted over years into something rigid and cruel. She's as trapped as we were, my mother said softly, in her own prison of fear disguised as faith. As if summoned by our conversation, Aunt Sarah appeared in the doorway. She looked different, smaller somehow, her face streaked with tears. In her hands she clutched a familiar object, my mother's rosary, the one she'd left with me that night. I found this, she said, her voice breaking. While going through my old things, I kept it. All these years I kept it. I told myself it was evidence of Amanda's abandonment, but she trailed off, her hand shaking. In that moment, looking at my aunt's broken expression, I remembered what Jesus had shown me about the interconnected web of all our lives, all our pain, all our healing. The darkness that had been consuming me began to recede, replaced by something stronger, understanding. Your father's abuse didn't end with your childhood, did it? I asked gently. You're still fighting him, still trying to control everything to feel safe. Aunt Sarah crumpled to her knees beside my mother's bed, decades of carefully constructed walls finally crumbling. And there, in a hospital room at 3 a.m, surrounded by the ghosts of our shared pain, something began to heal. What happened next in that hospital room would change everything. Aunt Sarah, still on her knees, reached into her bag and pulled out a worn leather diary. It was your grandfather's, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I found it after he died last year. I couldn't face what was in it until now. The diary revealed a generational curse of abuse and twisted faith. Our grandfather, a respected church elder, had methodically documented his discipline of his daughters, justifying every act of cruelty with scripture. He'd written about breaking their spirits to save their souls, about using fear to keep them pure. I became him, Aunt Sarah sobbed, clutching my mother's hand. I was so determined not to let evil touch you, Michael, that I became the very thing I feared. When Amanda left you at the church that night, with that letter explaining about your father's threats, I convinced myself I was saving you from both of them. My mother, weak but alert, reached for the diary. Father's last entry, she said, reading through tears, was about his greatest regret. Not the abuse, but that his eldest daughter had learned his lessons too well. He wrote that he prayed every day for God to save Sarah from becoming like him. The truth continued to unfold like a dark flower. Aunt Sarah had been 12 when she first stood between her father and my mother, taking beatings meant for her younger sister. She'd created an elaborate system of rules and rituals, believing they would keep them safe. When my mother started modeling, started dating, Aunt Sarah saw it as a betrayal of everything they'd suffered for. The night you left Michael at the church, Aunt Sarah turned to my mother. I was already there, praying. I saw you place him on the steps, saw you leave that letter. I waited until you were gone, convinced God had sent me to save another child from our family's sin. Emily, who had been silent in the corner, moved to sit beside her mother. All those years of controlling everything, of using religion as a weapon. You were still that scared little girl in the closet, weren't you, Mom? Aunt Sarah nodded, decades of rigid certainty crumbling. When Michael talked about his experience with Jesus, about pure love without fear, it terrified me. It went against everything I'd built my life around. If he was right, then everything I'd done, everything I'd believed, was based on fear. Not love, I finished quietly, understanding dawning like a sunrise. You weren't trying to hurt us, you were trying to protect us the only way you knew how. The monitors tracking my mother's vitals began showing improvement as the truth poured out. It was as if the release of these long-buried secrets was healing not just our hearts but her body as well. There's more, Aunt Sarah said, pulling out another bundle of letters from Michael's father. He didn't just threaten you, Amanda, he was watching us all those years. The real reason I kept sending Michael to the basement, keeping him inside. I saw his father lurking around the house several times. I never told anyone. I thought I could handle it alone, protect everyone myself. The revelation hit like a physical blow. All those years of imprisonment, of harsh discipline, had been Aunt Sarah's desperate attempt to protect me from a very real threat. Her methods were wrong, traumatically wrong, but her motivation hadn't been cruelty, it had been fear and love twisted by generational trauma. As the truth of our family's haunted past filled that hospital room, something extraordinary began to happen. My mother's vital signs, which had been steadily declining, started to improve dramatically. Color returned to her cheeks, her breathing became stronger, and the pain that had been etched on her face began to fade. Dr. Richards rushed in, drawn by the changing monitor readings. He checked and rechecked his instruments, ordered immediate blood tests, and stood baffled as the results came back. The aggressive cancer that had been consuming her body was retreating at an impossible rate. "I don't understand," he muttered, reviewing the scans. "This kind of spontaneous remission, it's unprecedented. The tumors are literally dissolving before our eyes." But we understood. The same divine presence that had rescued me from that mountain road, that had given my mother her first remission, was at work again. Only this time it wasn't just healing physical illness, it was healing generations of trauma. Aunt Sarah, who had spent decades wielding her faith like a weapon, fell to her knees beside the bed. "This is what real grace looks like," she whispered. "Not the fear I preached, not the control I demanded, but this pure love that heals what we cannot." The transformation wasn't just physical. Something shifted in the spiritual atmosphere of that room. Emily moved to embrace her mother, years of tension dissolving in tears of reconciliation. Sarah, who had been quietly supporting us all, joined the embrace, completing our circle of healing. Word spread quickly through the hospital. The kids from Hope Haven, who had been holding vigil in the waiting room, filled the doorway with wondering faces. Marcus, who had pulled me back from the brink earlier, stepped forward with tears in his eyes. "This is what you've been trying to teach us," he said. "That love is stronger than fear, that healing is possible, that our past doesn't have to define our future." The next few days were a blur of medical tests and tearful conversations. The doctors couldn't explain my mother's recovery, but they couldn't deny it either. The cancer was gone, completely gone, leaving not even a trace in her system. Aunt Sarah withdrew her complaint against me at Hope Haven. Instead, she asked to volunteer there, wanting to help other children trapped in cycles of religious trauma. Her first session, where she shared her own story of transformation from fear to love, left not a dry eye in the room. The local newspaper ran a story about our family's reconciliation and my mother's miraculous recovery. It caught the attention of other survivors of religious abuse, leading to the creation of a support group at Hope Haven specifically for healing from spiritual trauma. But the most profound change was in Aunt Sarah herself. The rigid, controlling woman who had dominated my childhood was gone, replaced by someone softer, more vulnerable, yet somehow stronger. She started therapy, began studying different approaches to faith and healing, and slowly learned to replace her fear-based theology with one centered on love and grace. I spent so long trying to control everything she confessed during a family dinner at my mother's house, trying to protect everyone through force and fear. But real protection, real love, means being willing to be vulnerable, to admit when we're wrong, to let God's love flow through us instead of trying to dictate its terms. Emily moved back home with her mother, working together to transform their old Victorian house from a place of fear into a halfway house for women and children escaping abuse. The basement where I had spent so many dark hours was renovated into a bright art therapy room. 1 year after that transformative night in the hospital, we gathered in the garden of Hope Haven to celebrate the opening of the Anderson Miller Family Center for Healing. The Victorian mansion that had once been a place of fear and control had been completely renovated, its dark corners filled with light and hope. My mother, now cancer-free and radiant with health, stood beside me as we cut the ribbon. She had sold her modeling agency and, together with Aunt Sarah, invested everything in creating this safe haven for families trapped in cycles of religious trauma and abuse. The center combined therapeutic support with gentle spiritual guidance, helping others find the same healing we had discovered. Sarah, who had become more than just a friend, she was now my fiancée, led the development of our trauma-informed care program. Her experience as the friend who had never given up on me, even when I tried to take us both off that cliff, brought a unique perspective to our work with families in crisis. Emily and Aunt Sarah worked side by side, their relationship healed and strengthened through their shared mission. The art therapy room in the former basement had become Emily's special domain, where she helped children express their trauma and hopes through creativity rather than fear. Marcus, now 18 and preparing for college, had become our youth program coordinator. His own journey from suicidal despair to hope made him uniquely qualified to reach troubled teens. Sometimes, he told a group of new residents, the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing you can offer others. The center's approach was revolutionary in its simplicity, combining professional therapy with spiritual healing, but always leading with love rather than doctrine. We created spaces for people to question, doubt, and explore their faith without fear of judgment. The garden became a place of meditation and healing, with a small chapel that welcomed all faiths or none. Pastor David, who had supported us through everything, became our spiritual advisor. His gentle approach to faith helped many find their way back to a God of love rather than fear. The miracle, he often said, isn't just in the physical healing, but in the restoration of broken spirits. The most profound transformation, though, was in our family dynamic. Sunday dinners became a tradition, with all of us gathering at my mother's house, me, Sarah, Mom, Aunt Sarah, Emily, and often some of the kids from the center who needed a taste of healthy family life. The conversations were deep, sometimes challenging, but always grounded in love and understanding. One evening, as we sat in the garden watching the sunset, my mother took my hand. "Do you remember what you saw in your near-death experience?" she asked. "About how all our lives are connected, how our pain can become purpose." I nodded, watching as Marcus helped a new resident plant flowers in the healing garden, while Aunt Sarah and Emily led a group therapy session on the porch. "This is what he meant," she said softly. "All of it, the pain, the separation, even the fear, it was all leading to this. Not just our healing, but creating a place where others can heal too." Looking back now, 5 years after that night I tried to end my life on a mountain road, I understand what Jesus meant when he showed me the interconnected web of all our lives. Every broken piece of my story, my mother's abandonment, Aunt Sarah's rigid abuse, my own descent into despair, became part of a larger tapestry of healing and redemption. The Anderson Miller Family Center has helped hundreds of families find their way back to love and faith. We've seen mothers reunited with children they thought lost forever, religious trauma survivors rediscover a God of love rather than fear, and generations of abuse cycles broken through understanding and grace. My mother's cancer never returned. She often says that healing comes in many forms: physical, emotional, spiritual, but the greatest healing is in using our pain to help others. She and Aunt Sarah now lead workshops together, sharing their story of how fear can distort love and how true faith leads us back to healing. Sarah and I married in the center's garden, surrounded by the very people our story had helped heal. Marcus was my best man, and many of our former residents formed a choir that sang songs of hope and redemption. Even Pastor Johnson from Aunt Sarah's old church came, humbled by the transformation he'd witnessed in our family. Emily's art therapy program has become a model for trauma recovery centers across the country. The walls of our center are covered with paintings and sculptures created by residents, each piece telling a story of darkness transformed into light. The basement, where I once knelt in fear, is now filled with children's laughter and creative expression. But perhaps the most powerful testament to our journey is what happens during our weekly community dinners. Around long tables in the garden, you'll find people from all walks of life: abuse survivors sitting next to their former abusers who found healing, religious leaders learning from those they once condemned, families being rebuilt one meal at a time. "Love is patient, love is kind," reads the inscription over our entrance. But now these words aren't just scripture, they're a lived reality. We've learned that true healing doesn't come from controlling or punishing, but from understanding and accepting. Every person who walks through our doors carries their own version of my story, their own mountain road moment, their own need for divine intervention. To those who still struggle with religious trauma, who carry the weight of twisted faith or family abuse, I want you to know your pain can become purpose. Your story isn't over. The same God who met me in my darkest moment, who healed my mother's cancer and transformed Aunt Sarah's heart, is still in the business of turning tragedy into triumph. And to those who, like me, have stood on the edge of giving up, whether it's a mountain road, a train track, or a hospital roof, know this: you are part of a bigger story. Your life is connected to countless others in ways you can't yet see. Hold on. The light is coming. As Jesus showed me in that divine encounter, pain shapes us but need not define us. Love is stronger than fear, grace more powerful than guilt, and healing possible even in our deepest wounds. This is not just my testimony, it's an invitation to anyone who needs to find their way back to hope. Our doors are always open. If this story has touched your heart or resonated with your own journey, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your experiences and reflections might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of faith, healing, and transformation. By subscribing, you're supporting our mission to share these messages of hope with others who are struggling. If you know someone who might be fighting their own battles with religious trauma, family wounds, or loss of faith, please share this video with them. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in our struggles can make all the difference. Hit the like button if this story touched you, and join our community of healing and hope. Together we can help more people find their way from darkness to light.